When my grandparents decided to downsize in 2016, I was 9 years old. They had built the house in the early 90s, and it is situated on 5 acres on the outskirts of a small southern town. Woods and open fields surround it, and a slow, muddy river winds past our southern fence line on 2 sides. Our property touches the land of our only neighbors, a strange, crooked patch of acreage with an old farmhouse that felt like it was sinking into the ground. The yard was a nightmare, with overgrown bushes tangled with vines, broken fountains surrounded by weeds, gnomes missing their heads, and old trash that looked like it had been there for years. Grocery bags flapped in the tree branches, and a rusted lawn mower sat in the center of the property. It had been added to in all the wrong ways over the years, like someone stapled extra rooms together without a plan. The siding was discolored and soft-looking every time you looked at it, even on dry days. When you passed the house, you felt as though you should hold your breath because the grass had died in the middle of the job and had never been moved. At the time, the house had 3 children and 2 elderly sisters, Violet and Agnes. Violet was the quieter of the 2, always sitting on the porch in a faded green rocking chair and watching the trees. Agnes was more active and sharper, but she still moved as if her bones hurt. Both women were in their 70s, and the children were their grandchildren. We were in the same class, so we were frequently lumped together. Liam was strange. I didn't like him and I didn't want to hang out with him, but he took that as permission to just show up at my house whenever he wanted, without knocking or texting. One day, I was playing a game in my room when I turned around and he was there. The other 2 girls in my grade at school were Allison and Kelsey, and they were the same age as my younger sister. When we hung out, he wasn't fun. He was really obsessed with anime, but I didn't watch any, so I had no idea what he was talking about. He would say strange things in Japanese and get upset when I didn't laugh. At one point, he chased me while wearing a look in his eyes that suggested he was imagining something violent. Another time, he walked straight into the kitchen, opened our fridge, and began eating a slice of leftover pizza with his hands as if it were no big deal, swinging them around with a pair of sharp garden shears and laughing as if it were a game. Another time, we were on an old wooden bridge that crossed a creek close to the back of our properties, and I swear he tried to push me in. He said it was a joke, but I could tell by the way he smiled that he meant it. The twins were quiet and nearly invisible, their clothes were always filthy, and they had speech impairments that made it difficult to understand them. It was clear that no one at home was helping them with their voices. When I first saw Teresa, she was attempting to connect a hose to the spigot at the edge of their property, close to our side yard. She was taller than anyone else in her family, heavy-set, with long, thick, curly black hair and glasses that looked like they belonged in the 1980s. They were jumbled like toddlers, even though they were 7 years old, and they flinched easily. They also always looked hungry. Was unique in that she dressed differently than the rest of the family, had clean clothes, and always had her hair styled. She smiled at me as if she had been waiting for me to visit, and when she said that the faucet was stuck, I went over and turned it, and it moved easily. She gasped and clapped, telling me that I was very strong and how fortunate she was that I had come over. I felt proud of her because she made me feel special. Then she said, "Did you know you have a third? We all have one eye, not a physical one, but a spiritual one." She said, "It lets you see the truth, whatever that means." Before I could ask anything more, she began to walk back toward her house and invited me to accompany her. I did, and the inside of their home hit me like a wave of rot and smelled like spoiled food. I tried to leave, but Teresa caught my wrist and dragged me upstairs. Her room was completely different from the rest of the house. It was immaculate, with pink wallpaper, clean carpet, shelves full of porcelain dolls, and very ornate old furniture. The air smelled like rose water and old perfume, and the smell of rotting food on plates, garbage bags torn open, and dirty diapers stuffed behind the couch. She motioned me to sit on a small cushioned stool in the corner of the building before leading me to her vanity and opening a drawer. From there, she took out a thick leather-bound book, a silver tray with a black candle, a crystal, and a pentagram. My stomach turned when I saw the pentagram on the cover. My parents are Catholic, so I knew what that symbol meant. Suddenly, I began seeing it everywhere, on the jewelry box, on the frame of the mirror, and peering out from beneath the corner of the rug on the floor, etched into the wood. I didn't wait for a response, so I jumped up and said, "Sorry, my mom wants me home by." In 2019, Agnes had a heart attack and died inside the house. I heard that she collapsed in front of all the kids in the living room. I went to the funeral, which was held in a dilapidated Baptist church on the outskirts of town. The family was expressionless, as if they didn't know how to respond, with the exception of a woman I had never seen before, who sat in the second pew and sobbed so loudly that no one paid her any attention. That same year, Liam vanished. I never knew all the details, but I remember my parents sitting my sister and I down that night and telling us unequivocally that we were never to go near that family again. Their faces were serious and grim, and that's when it all clicked, all the little things I didn't understand, the strange things, the fear. Eventually, the rest of the family moved out, leaving Violet alone in that crumbling house, an elderly, frail woman. She died alone in that house in 2020. Her estate was put up for auction, and a few months later, one of my former elementary school teachers, Mrs. S., and her husband purchased it. They demolished most of the building but preserved the 1920 portion, which was where Teresa's room had been. Mrs. S. invited us to view the renovations, which included a gorgeous open floor plan, new appliances, and fresh paint. When she showed us upstairs, my skin began to crawl. I avoided the house until last year when Mrs. S. asked me to dog sit while they were out of town for a week. I said yes, figuring it would be easy money, and every night I'd ring the doorbell and they'd buzz me in. I felt sick, even though the floors were carpeted, like something was watching me from the walls. I told Mrs. S. that I had a headache and had to leave, and she was disappointed because I was supposed to stay for dinner. The first 4 nights were quite calm, even though I fed the dogs, played with them for a while, turned on the porch light, and locked up. However, on the last night, just before I was leaving, Henry began barking at the staircase. He planted his little legs and just barked over and over, and Muffin backed away, whimpering that nothing was there, and then there was a thump. The Smartlocks dogs, a snorting little pug named Henry and a Shih Tzu named Muffin, would greet me with tails wagging. In 2025, we hadn't heard anything about the family for more than 4 years, until a girl from school told me she had seen Teresa at a farmer's market in a nearby town. Apparently, she started a religious group called the Truth Seekers, and they live in a mobile home community far out in the country. Upstairs, there was another thump louder this time, so I didn't stay to investigate. Instead, I ran to the front door, slammed it behind me, and locked it. I think Teresa is genuinely evil. She neglected her children and left her mother in that house to rot, and I believe she brought something dark into it that remained. I still have nightmares about her and Liam standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me and not saying a word, and every time I pass that house, even now, I get chills. Woods flyers have started appearing on telephone poles and bulletin boards. My name is Keegan, and I live in Michigan with my parents. High school was a good time for me because I got to meet a lot of new people there, but I also had some people I tended to hang out with outside of school. The only times I really spent time with them were at places like my local community center, where we would work out and play basketball. The furniture is all surface level, and I don't think it ever let go of what happened there. I didn't have the fastest start because, in my freshman year, it was almost the end of the year, and I was looking forward to summer break. I would be starting driver's training and even taking on a side job to at least start earning money. I had a friend named Clayton, with whom I would typically hang out at least once a week. He was a grade lower than me, but we were somewhat close, and my dad and I even took him to a Detroit Pistons basketball game at. He was the type of person who had some pretty intense anger issues when he got pissed off enough. I remember this one day when I told him I wasn't free again and that I would be home cleaning, and it seemed like he was starting to change. He was a huge basketball fan, so he was more than eager to attend his first game despite all the fun activities in the past. However, it wasn't until I started getting busier that he started to change. He would pick specific days when I wasn't available to hang out. I didn't check my phone until I was done cleaning and discovered that he had deleted me from Snapchat. I messaged him on Messenger to find out why he was so upset and why he had decided to remove me as a friend. He assumed I was lying to get out of hanging out with him, and I occasionally followed up on it because he was getting increasingly annoying. He felt so excluded that one day, after the sun had set, he unexpectedly showed up at my apartment where I was living. I asked him why he hadn't texted me beforehand, but he just stared at me for a few seconds before slowly leaving. Why was he here at this hour? Why didn't he say anything? He gave me this thousand-why stare as if I had done something to offend him. The following day, I hadn't spoken to him. Turned off my Snapchat Snap Map to conceal my location from him after he reportedly added me back. A month had passed, and he was still the same person, angry or depressed when I couldn't visit him. At that point, I received a text from my friend Nick, whom I hardly ever saw in person, who knew Clayton, and his ex-girlfriend Nick had told me some graphic details about him and his past, but my heart fell when I learned from him and Clayton's ex that he had a knife at his ex-girlfriend's throat, and I immediately removed him as a friend on all platforms after he sexually assaulted her. He texted me on Instagram before I did the same, and he bombarded my phone with messages asking why I was doing so. I told him that I needed some time to myself and that I would add him back when I was better, but I used that as an excuse to avoid him that night while I was at home by myself because my parents were going to the next town for dinner with some old friends of mine. When I heard a knock on my apartment door, I looked through the peephole and saw no one. I opened the door slightly to look around the hallway, but no one was there, so I assumed it was someone ding-dong ditching. However, when I looked out my bedroom window at random, the light was burned out by the sidewalk, and I saw a tiny flash in the corner of my eye, which I assumed was coming from inside someone's car. I felt sick to my stomach when I saw a tall figure standing in front of my window. I firmly told him that I didn't want him here when I opened my window and told him to leave. He then told me to let him in so he could tell me something, but when he started to move around a little, I noticed something in his hand. I couldn't quite make out what he was holding until he held it up, and I was so terrified that I thought I might faint. Clayton was holding a knife in his hand, and I told him I was calling the police. I believe he had murderous intentions, so I assumed he probably ended up in juvie after what happened. Not only was I horrified by that experience, but it may have been one of the most traumatic moments of my life having your body in front of the police. He had already taken off by the time they arrived, so I gave them the best description I could of him. I haven't heard anything about him or from him since that horrible night. I'm glad I cut off all communication with him at that point because I believe that if I had stayed friends with him, I might have become one of his endless punching bags or worse, dead. This occurred in late 2022 when I went on what I thought would be a straightforward and enjoyable first date with Emily, whom I had matched with on a dating app. We had been texting for about 2 weeks before deciding to meet up. When Smile came out, we decided that seeing it together would be the ideal first date. We chose a Thursday night, a weekday, and it was a late showing at a small, older theater just outside of town at 10:15 p.m. I offered to drive and picked her up at around 9:30. She seemed normal, friendly, and perhaps a little shy. She was quiet for the majority of the drive, but she opened up once we started discussing the horror films we enjoyed as kids. The parking lot was nearly deserted when we arrived, and I made a joke about how the theater looked like something from a horror movie. There were dim lights and flickering neon, and there was only one man working at the concession stand. When I asked if the theater would be packed, he laughed and said that we were the only ones who had purchased tickets for that showing. At first, I thought that was fantastic. No crowds, just me and the movie. We went into Theater 6 and selected. We sat back and chatted while waiting for the previews to start. Emily immediately pointed out that it was freezing in the middle, about 4 rows from the back. I offered her my hoodie and we laughed about how unsettling it felt to be the only people in the room. I was beginning to feel a little chemistry between us, so I assumed this would be one of those dates where you actually end up seeing the person again. Just before the movie started, like right after the last trailer and just as, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement as the lights went down. The person entering the theater didn't say anything, didn't pause to look around or check their phone for seat numbers like most people do, and instead walked slowly up the stairs and sat directly behind us. I mean, there were probably 100 open seats, but he picked the one directly behind me. Emily turned to face him as well, and she gave me a strange look like, "Really?" and I kind of laughed. I glanced back after a minute or two, but he wasn't watching the screen. Instead, he was staring at us. I only saw him for a moment, but he didn't flinch or turn away, nor did he even pretend to be interested in the movie. Instead, he was just sitting forward a little, as someone might do if they were truly into a scene. I sat under my breath figures, but immediately something felt off. You know that feeling when someone's eyes are burning into the back of your head. We tried to ignore it for a while, and when the movie started, I really tried to get into it, but every few minutes I felt the presence behind us again. This time, it wasn't just someone being obnoxious. There was an intensity to it, as if he was waiting for something. The screen was angled directly at us, and I whispered to Emily, "He's just staring." She nodded slowly and whispered back, "I know." In order to look back more casually, I leaned forward in my chair and turned my head slightly. He was still staring, and I noticed that he was in his middle or late 40s. He was clean-shaven and somewhat pale, and he was wearing a dark gray hoodie. His eyes didn't appear to be glazed over like someone who was dozing off, and he never blinked. I turned around and whispered to Emily, "This guy is really creeping me out." She appeared truly frightened. "Now, do you want to move?" We thought about it, but where would we go? We were already in the best seats, and moving might make things awkward or even agitate him. A few minutes later, I felt the guy breathe on me, not loudly or overly, a deep, slow exhale that was right behind my seat. I turned around, and he was leaning forward over the back of my seat, his face closer than it should have been. I said, "Dude, can you not?" And he didn't answer. Instead, he just slowly leaned back in his seat. I told Emily, "Let's move," and we got up and moved to the front corner row. It was awful, and the angle wasn't great, but we needed space. I was having trouble concentrating on the movie anymore, and every time I looked back, he was staring directly at us and didn't move. We heard footsteps coming down the stairs halfway through the film, and Emily grabbed my arm to keep us both motionless. The footsteps stopped a few rows above us, and we didn't turn around for however long. When he finally walked back up to the top row, I whispered, "We need to leave." She nodded, and we gathered our belongings and slipped out quietly as we left the theater and headed down the hallway toward the lobby. I looked back through We went straight to the front and informed the concession guy that someone was acting strangely in Theater 6. His smile vanished instantly, and he asked, "Again? What do you mean again?" He paused, then said, "He's been coming in randomly for like a month, always late shows, and never buys anything you guys." He was standing in the aisle, staring at us through the glass window in the theater door. "Aren't the first ones to complain about him?" I replied, "Why hasn't anyone kicked him out?" He appeared uneasy and said, "He doesn't technically do anything illegal, but management says we can't really do much unless he touches someone or breaks a rule." Emily was on the verge of tears when she asked if someone could walk us to our car, and he agreed. One of the janitors then walked us out, but the guy didn't follow us that night, at least not that we saw, but for weeks afterward, I was paranoid that he might have written down my license plate, watched us go, and discovered where Emily lived when I dropped her off. My cop friend also told me it was a bunch of bullshit, that they couldn't do anything about him, and the theater, being a business, would have the right to evict anyone, so I stayed away from that area of town. Emily and I spoke a few times after that, but we never saw each other again. I believe that we were both too shaken by what had happened, and I haven't returned to that theater since, even if the website doesn't contain any reviews of the man. I wonder how many people actually have genuinely had the same encounter.